Welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about the 2018 movie called Vice. Directed by Adam McKay, Vice chronicles the life and political career of Dick Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States. Cheney, who is played by Christian Bale in the movie, rises through the ranks of the Republican Party, ultimately becoming one of the most powerful and controversial figures in modern American politics. And yes, that means today's episode is about politics, because the movie we're talking about today is about politics. And I know, I hate hearing about politics all the time too, but you know that saying, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it? Well, how can we learn from our past if we never talk about what really happened? So we're going to talk about politics today, but maybe you're not in the mood to hear about politics right now. That's okay. You can come back when you're ready to hear some politics from a history podcast, or just find one of my other videos to watch, because this is a history podcast and not a political one. Today, those circles just happen to overlap. And with that in mind, I wanted to add a quick disclaimer now, because I recorded our interview a few months ago. So this is actually releasing in July of 2024, and it was recorded in February. Now, that is not unusual. It's very common for me to record an episode that far in advance for a number of reasons. What is unusual is that I'm explaining that. In fact, I don't remember that I've ever explained this on the podcast before, because 99.99999% of the time, it doesn't matter very much because history is evergreen. But not all history. If you've kept up with American politics in the past few months, a lot has happened and a lot has changed. So all of that is to say that some of the things in our discussion might have already changed from the time that we recorded it, because the film explores a lot of things that aren't going to be officially documented, but there's still things that we pretty much expect any politician to do, like the behind-the-scenes machinations and power grabs, which the movie shows throughout Cheney's tenures as White House Chief of Staff, Chairman of the House Republican Conference, Secretary of Defense, and of course, Vice President to George W. Bush. With an all-star cast and Adam McKay's satirically comedic style, Vice is a very funny comedy film that paints a dark portrait of American politics. And if there's one thing I think we can all agree on, it's that the current state of politics is quite grim, which is why today's guest is perfect to help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, because today we'll be joined by William Cooper, the author of a new book called How America Works and Why It Doesn't, a brief guide to the U.S. political system. His book is available right now, and you can get your own copy with the link in the show notes. But before we chat with William, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Dick Cheney really did have a heart transplant. Number 2, George W. Bush was a newcomer to politics, so he did whatever the more experienced Cheney told him to. Number 3, Dick Cheney continued to support his daughter even after she came out. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie, and of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with William Cooper about the historical accuracy of Vice. At the very beginning of the movie, there's some text that I'll quote here. It says, "The following is a true story," or as true as it can be, given that Dick Cheney is known as one of the most secretive leaders in history. But we did our best. So with an opening like that in the movie, I have to ask, if you were to give Vice an overall letter grade for how well it did in telling the true story, what would it get?
I like the movie. I think there's a lot of nuggets of truth. But the overall grade would probably be a C, maybe C minus.
For something like this, where it's specifically talking about how it's secretive, we already know that governments are not the most forthcoming with things, then that's actually, I was expecting a lot worse, to be honest.
Yeah, there were some errors that were quite extreme, but there were also a number of instances where I think they conveyed some important truths and did so accurately. And so when you mix it all together, I don't think it would be fair to say it's an F, because it wasn't completely fictional by any means. So it was a nice mix and somewhere right in the middle of the continuum.
Well, the movie does start in 1963. And at that time, according to the movie, Dick Cheney kind of seems to be a drunk who's getting low C's, D's, and F's at Yale. And the movie points out it's a college that he's really only able to get into because of his girlfriend, Lynn. So Lynn kind of gives Dick an ultimatum at the beginning of the movie: either straighten up and become someone, or I'm leaving you. And then in the opening title sequence, we see footage of Dick and Lynn getting married. And right afterwards, then it's 1968. So we can see Dick Cheney in the congressional internship program in DC. So the overall impression that I get was that Lynn was a very strong driver behind Dick Cheney turning his life around and getting into politics. How well do you think the movie did setting up some of this stuff before the timeline of the movie itself for Dick Cheney?
I thought it was done well from a theatrical perspective. I don't know the intricacies of Dick and Lynn and how that phase of their life went, and I'm not sure if much of that's in the public domain. I do know that Lynn Cheney was very much a partner to Dick throughout his career. She's very intelligent in her own right and successful in her own right, and was certainly a driver for him and somebody focused on his career. I think she valued his success quite a bit. So in that sense, I think it got it right. In terms of the true intricacy of how the couple was there in the 60s and exactly what Lynn said to Dick, I don't want to overstate my knowledge, and I don't know exactly how that went.
Right, and that makes sense. It sounds like, to make sure I'm understanding, it sounds like there were some nuggets of truth in there, but then the filmmakers probably had to fill in some of those intricate details and conversations, which makes sense that we're not going to know all those intricacies of what was going on.
Absolutely. I think the filmmakers had nuggets of truth. They filled in blanks, and then they just manufactured their own nuggets as well. And that was the medley for the movie of those three elements.
Okay. Well, in the movie, the first time we see Dick Cheney entering politics is working under Donald Rumsfeld in the administration of President Richard Nixon. Of course, that doesn't really last too long, as Nixon resigns after the whole Watergate scandal. But Cheney has gotten a taste of politics with this, and it seems like he wants more. So after that, we see Cheney becoming the White House chief of staff for President Gerald Ford. While in that position, he opposes things like the Undetectable Firearms Act to ban plastic guns that can evade metal detectors, as well as voting nay on the Endangered Species Act, which it passed despite Cheney's vote, according to the movie. But I was doing a little bit of research on it because it sounded like an important thing. And it says that it's only a few hundred, I think, nesting pairs of bald eagles were in existence in the 60s. And because of the bill's passing, that was a big reason why they and other animals were able to be brought back from the brink of extinction. So the impression, and the reason I set all that up, the impression I got while I was watching the movie was it seems like Cheney is voting on what could be considered some sensitive topics, but he must have had a strong belief in them. It seems like he has this strong belief. And then there's this twist in the movie where there's this scene where Cheney asks Rumsfeld, when he first starts, he point blank asks Rumsfeld, what do we believe in? And then Rumsfeld just laughs at the question like it's the silliest thing to ask. And so then I changed my perspective. I was like, well, maybe Dick Cheney doesn't have any morals of his own. He's pretty much just a yes man for whatever his boss wants. What do you think of the movie's portrayal of Cheney in his time with the Nixon and then Ford administrations?
I think the part of the movie that suggests Cheney has very strong convictions and personal views is accurate. I think the scene where Rumsfeld suggests that they don't really care about policy outcomes in that way was very false. Both Cheney and Rumsfeld, for better and for worse, depending if you agree with them on any given issue, have extremely strong convictions and beliefs. And that's been a big driver of their entire careers, including Cheney's. I think he very strongly believes in all sorts of really big things. Now, he's a politician, so he's willing to sacrifice things to get other things done. He's also, never been president of the United States, so he has to be a loyal soldier in his administrations at times. So I'm not saying that everything he's ever said or done has been consistent with his views. But I do think a really strong conservative worldview, both domestically and internationally, has driven his career, and that he does believe in a lot of what he's done and in what he's said. I think the same is true for Rumsfeld.
Okay. That is a different impression than what I get in the movie, where it seems like they're doing a lot of things just to, I mean, they are politicians, but it seems like they're really letting that drive things more than their actual beliefs. And I guess it was that line in the movie that really solidified that for me. It's like, what do we believe in? Like, just tell me what to believe in, and I'll believe in that. Like, okay.
No, I think that Cheney is studied history, and he's a PhD candidate before he came in, and Lynn as well. I think they have very thorough, thoughtful beliefs. Dick's daughter, Liz Cheney, I think is showing that today in her politics, including the stand she's taking against President Trump. Now, again, as politicians, you always have to sacrifice. You always have to say things in certain ways, and to get things done. In a legislative contest, you have to horse trade. So I don't mean they never sacrificed in any given issue, but underlying it, I think there were very strong views.
Would the movie be correct then to suggest that a lot of Cheney's early days in politics were under Rumsfeld as basically his mentor, is kind of what it seems to be in the movie?
Absolutely. Rumsfeld hired him. The movie got that right. Congressional relations for Rumsfeld and the Nixon administration. And then the two hit it off, started what was going to be a multi-decade friendship and collaboration in politics. Cheney followed Rumsfeld to Ford, who Cheney knew, Rumsfeld and Ford were friends when Rumsfeld and Ford were both in Congress. And then when Ford came into the presidency, he asked Rumsfeld to come back from NATO in Brussels and be his chief of staff. Cheney was Rumsfeld's deputy. And then when Rumsfeld moved to the Department of Defense under Ford, Cheney stepped in as chief of staff. And you're exactly right. Those two have very strong, long-lasting relationship. And that's what led Rumsfeld to come back as Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush.
Yeah, mentioning Bush there, if we fast forward a few years in the movie's timeline to when George H.W. Bush was the vice president under Ronald Reagan, there's some scenes in the movie that I wanted to ask about, because we start to see Cheney trying to secure a new level of power for the presidency. And there's a few times where that comes up. The first is a meeting between Cheney and a lawyer named Antonin Scalia, where Cheney tries to find out if an American president can have, as the movie puts it, absolute executive authority. And there's another time after a chat between Cheney and then Vice President George H.W. Bush, when Cheney tells his wife, Lynn, that he respects a lot of what Reagan has done, but no one has shown the world the true power of the American presidency. And that's a quote from the movie. And the movie doesn't call it this. It doesn't use this terminology. But as I was watching that, I couldn't help but think of a single word to describe what it's like when a country has a leader that has absolute power. That's a dictatorship. Do you think the movie was correct to imply that Dick Cheney was trying to find a way to give an American president unlimited power?
No, I think that was very inaccurate. I think the range of debate about presidential power is very cabined in this country, even among conservatives and liberals and scholars. Nobody, including Dick Cheney, thinks the president, for example, should dominate the judicial branch and start ruling on disputes. Nobody thinks the president, and conservatives particularly focus on this. Nobody thinks the president can legislate without having both houses of Congress pass legislation. Dictators do everything. They dictate the workings of government across the board. What Cheney was advocating was a very strong president, a very strong executive branch. And the Constitution says that the executive power, I'm paraphrasing, but it's close to that, the executive power is vested in a president of the United States. So it doesn't say it's vested in a president and his administration or a president and her administrative bodies. It's very clear that the president has all of that authority in the Constitution. Now, what Cheney and others, William Barr, I think, is another example of this that's more recent. They've advocated for really expanding presidential powers, but nowhere in any argument, whether it's Cheney or Barr or Rumsfeld or George W. Bush or John Yoo or any of these scholars and government officials, is an argument that the president should cover all of government the way a dictator would. That's just not on the table at all.
Okay. I mean, well, that's a good thing.
Yes, I agree.
Maybe for listeners who are not in the United States, not familiar with the way politics works here, can you give a little more context around how the presidential power is now versus other people in power? Like, for example, with Cheney in the movie, like he's not the president at this point, but he's looking to gain power for the presidency. And then as a little follow-up to that, there's also some scenes where we see, as Cheney's starting to go for vice presidency, not to get too far ahead of the movie's timeline, but we start to see that he's looking for some similar sorts of power for the vice presidency, which then implies that position also doesn't have as much power as maybe some others. Or can you kind of clarify all of that for our listeners?
Yeah. One thing to keep in mind about Cheney is he had a very formative experiences that led to his views of executive power by the time he was vice president. So he saw Nixon get impeachment proceedings against him and resign. He saw Ford have a really hard time taking the mantle there. And then in Congress, he was very heavily involved in the Iran-Contra affair, where Ronald Reagan was investigated by Congress. So he had all of these experiences, and his view, right or wrong, was that there was an imbalance and the president didn't have enough power. And so he was trying to shift it back where it was supposed to be, according to Cheney, not expand it beyond where it should be. He was just trying to basically right the constitutional ship, if that makes sense. Now, how the vice president fits into this, vice president does not have a lot of formal power. The vice president is a constitutional officer, certainly has a lot of authority compared to many other government actors. For example, the vice president casts the deciding vote in the Senate if there's a tie. As we saw in 2001, January 6th, the vice president can be involved to varying degrees in electoral certification, things like that. There's arguments in that domain about what the right role is for the vice president. But in general, the vice president's authority is derivative from the president. So what does the president delegate to the vice president? And it can be enormous, as we saw with Cheney. It can be quite large. I think Joe Biden was a good example when he was Obama's president. And it can also be very small and ministerial. And we've seen a number of vice presidents in that category as well. But in terms of the formal power from the Constitution, there's nowhere near as much in the vice president as there is in the president. The authority really does come from the president.
Okay. So to feed that back is in relation to the movie, then Cheney was trying to add is the wrong term, because as you were suggesting, you were saying, it's not there and it should be there. But to get it back to where it was, not only for the presidency, but also for the vice presidency as well.
I think I think that's right. And the way I might phrase it would be, Cheney was advocating for very strong executive power. There's no question about that. And how he fit into that equation was the more power Cheney was arguing for that the president should have when George W. Bush was president. Therefore, in turn, the more power George W. Bush could delegate to him if Bush chose to do so. Now, there's a lot of disagreement among people and a lot of different versions of the relationship between Bush and Cheney. And I'll caveat everything I say by Dick Cheney is a huge lightning rod in American politics to this day. Very strong opinions about him. And just about everything I say, you could very easily find people who would disagree. And most of them would probably find him much more extreme, very, very, very good or very, very bad. I'm more in the middle with Cheney. than any extreme. So I'll just caveat the whole the whole show with that he's very controversial. But one thing I was going to say is the relationship between Bush and Cheney, I think, very strongly was nowhere near as simple as a lot of people think. A lot of people think, in the movie, I think, portrayed it this way, that Bush was in some ways almost following Cheney, even though Bush was president. Cheney had this incredible influence over him. There's lots of examples that are established facts in the historical record that undercut that narrative. Two of them I'll give you now. One is Cheney pushed very hard for Bush to pardon Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, who was convicted of a crime flowing from political events in Washington, D.C. And Bush refused to do it. He didn't do it. It was a very strong rebuff of Cheney. And it's also understood that Cheney was advocating very hard in the second term for the United States to do much more with Iran in terms of military action and activity. And Bush pushed back, and rejected Cheney's advice. So the idea that Bush would just do whatever Cheney said is far too simple.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I did definitely get that sense where Bush was the newcomer to politics. I think, we saw a scene where it was H.W. Bush and with Cheney and then the younger Bush and makes a scene at that party. And that was, before he was running for president or anything like that. But then when that time came in the movie, I definitely got the sense, okay, Cheney's the guy who's been around the block, and he's kind of going to show this young Bush how to do politics, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there is some truth to that. I think Bush looked up to Cheney. I think Cheney was very influential, but the caricature in the movie and in a lot of people's minds, just this extreme version of their dynamic, I don't think is true. I will also add, I think Cheney was much more intelligent and knowledgeable about politics and government than Bush. Bush wasn't a complete novice. He was the governor of Texas. His father was president. But Cheney's experience, was very deep in Nixon and Ford administrations, a decade in Congress. And so I think, and then, Secretary of Defense after that. So he was a senior figure in a lot of ways, but just not the caricature of the extreme version of that. I think is quite inaccurate.
According to the movie, one of the reasons why Cheney leaves politics, and because he's got all this experience going on, but then the impression is that, okay, Cheney's going to be in line to be president. But then in the movie, we see one of his daughters, Mary, comes out as gay. And at that time, Cheney, being the White House chief of staff, seems like it's time for him to run. But running as a Republican and having a lesbian daughter seems like something that's not going to work for a Republican presidential candidate. So instead of putting his daughter through what would happen if he ran for president, Cheney decides to leave politics, and he becomes the CEO of an oil services company called Halliburton. And then in this part in the movie, this credits just start rolling and talk about how Cheney never entered politics again, regularly ran the Iron Man, things like that. Obviously a joke. But was the movie right in showing the reason why Cheney left politics?
It's a great question. I don't know, and I'm not sure if the public domain is clear on that. It may be. What I do know is that Cheney certainly supported his daughter and didn't take positions contrary to, her views. And it wouldn't surprise me if he made some decisions about what he was going to do in order to keep that respect for his daughter. And then Liz, of course, chose the different route, and there was some fallout there where Liz initially came out against lesbian rights, but then changed her mind. And my understanding is that there was some dissension among the family as a result of that. So I don't know all the nuances there, but it certainly would not surprise me if that was a big part of the equation.
With the move to Halliburton, then, because the movie doesn't show any of this, can you fill in a little bit more context around Dick Cheney's time as CEO of Halliburton?
Yeah, so He actually went to Halliburton after being the Secretary of Defense. So he was chief of staff it was in the 70s. And when Carter beat Ford, that's when he stopped being chief of staff, and then he ran for Congress. It wasn't until he was after Secretary of Defense under H.W. Bush that he went to Halliburton. I think he went in 95. So it was a couple of years after Clinton beat Bush and came into office. And it was, a really obvious sort of open example of the military industrial complex. I mean, he was the Secretary of Defense. A lot of people in those roles try to go into some unrelated area so that they're not accused of capitalizing on their government service. Donald Rumsfeld, for example, explained that he went into pharmaceuticals because he didn't want to go from Secretary of Defense to being some CEO of a company that would benefit from, the United States foreign policies. Cheney swatted that aside, waltzed right in and right as CEO, and made a ton of money. And Halliburton that whole time was a big part of their business was military and oil and things of that nature. So he didn't show any shame with taking that job and earning a lot of money.
In the movie, since we don't really see any of that, the assumption is that he's basically just leaving politics. But it sounds like maybe he still had some sway in politics, even as CEO of Halliburton, at least to the point to where he'd benefit from it monetarily.
I don't know if I'm not aware of anything in the public record that would suggest that he would influence policy in some sort of sinister way. Like he would go into, the Bill Clinton's administration and try to argue to people that we should invade this country and hire Halliburton. I don't think it was like that direct. But there were enormous things in motion already, some of which he set in motion, that he and Halliburton profited from while he was there. No question about it. So I don't think it was illegal. I'm not aware of any illegal activity or lobbying that was crossed any explicit legal lines. But there's no question that he benefited from the very thing, a lot of the very same things that his fingerprints were all over from being Secretary of Defense. And that's true. If you're Secretary of Defense for several years, the ripple effects in the pond from your service are going to last for years. And if you jump right into a government contractor in that space, you're going to be benefiting from decisions you made.
Yeah, and that's something that I've always, not just with the Secretary of Defense, but with any political position of that, where when they leave, it's like not like their decisions that they made stop right then and there. And so they leave, and then if they go to a company like Halliburton as CEO, and they're benefiting from that, okay, I could see how that would be a gray area for sure.
Yeah, I personally, I don't. It's not illegal. You're allowed to do it. My personal view is that it's a mistake. And somebody who's Secretary of Defense can get a lot of jobs, and they can make a lot of money in a lot of different ways. And I think it sends a better signal to society, and it's more healthy for society to do something unrelated. That's just my personal opinion.
Well, in the movie, Dick Cheney's departure from politics just doesn't last long. We see that the former president, George H.W. Bush, his son, George Bush, as we mentioned before, he calls up Cheney and asks him to join his ticket as the vice president, but Cheney being the vice president on the presidential ticket for Bush. And according to the movie, Cheney agrees, but he also pushes to handle some of the more mundane jobs like military, energy, foreign energy. And Cheney also tells Bush that, he's not going to basically deal with any of the anti-gay messaging that is in Bush's campaign. And Bush agrees to this as long as Cheney's okay with the messaging being in the campaign to begin with. He seems to be okay with it. And so that's how the movie shows Dick Cheney becoming the VP candidate with George W. Bush. And that messaging thing was kind of a throwback to what we were talking about earlier, where he talks about, tell me what to believe in. I almost had this idea of, well, at first he has this moral stance, and now he's like, well, okay, I'm okay with just pushing that to the side for this, in this case, running for vice president. And then the movie makes a point to mention there's no medical records, no tax or corporate filings revealed, nothing. Is that really what happened for Cheney joining the presidential candidacy?
My understanding is that he did not turn over documents that were requested. He didn't break the law in doing so, but he did depart from tradition. And as far as his daughter goes and the anti-gay messaging, they must have just drawn that line and said, I'm not going to do it myself, but I'm okay. We're okay participating in an administration. I think the impulse behind that line drawing might be back to what we talked about at the very beginning. I think the Cheneys as a family have very strong beliefs, and they really care about making an impact. I mean, there's, Dick served in all of these roles, and Liz followed in his footsteps, and so I think it may have been the case that there was a understanding that Cheney himself would not say anything that was anti-gay, but if he could go in and be an influential vice president, they could get a lot of conservative objectives achieved that they wanted to, and that was a trade-off they were willing to take.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if that's especially talking about, as we were saying earlier, being a politician. I mean, sometimes you have your own personal beliefs, but you're going to go with something else.
Yeah,
something else.
Purity is not. It's just not a virtue you get to keep if you go into politics. And one of the things I liked a lot about the movie is I think it did dramatize and accentuate some of that, but it's important to show that, if you're being hypocritical as a politician, you should be criticized even if there's no way around it. And I think the movie served a good purpose in some of that, highlighting some of those hypocrisies.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we also see that with Bush as well. I know he's mostly focused on Cheney, but I couldn't help but also get the sense that Bush was maybe inspired by Cheney, because we saw Cheney earlier with Rumsfeld, as we talked about, tell me what to believe in. And now, again, the movie was kind of pushing that Bush is following Cheney's lead, even though Bush is running for president and Cheney's vice president. But then I get the idea that Bush also is like, well, I'm going to have this, messaging against gay marriage in my campaign. But okay, it's okay if you kind of don't agree with that. I'm just doing this to get the votes, is the impression that I got as I was watching the movie. Is that a very fair impression to get, or do you think that's just the movie being the movie?
I think that's a fair impression. That was mine too. I think, especially if you're running for president, you have to have your constituencies. And Bush, the math was probably pretty clear that if Bush did not take that position, it would harm him at the polls. And so if you're going to run, you might as well try to win, right? I mean, that's sort of the whole point, is to win the election and to get your constituents. Again, personally, I strongly disagree with that position of Bush's, but my sense is the same as yours. Not something that he cared about deeply, but something he was really easy for him to get behind, because Karl Rove and others were explaining to him how important it was.
Yeah. Do what it takes to get the vote. That's politics.
That's the game. Yeah. Don't play baseball if you don't want to hit the ball. Don't play politics if you don't want to, cobble together votes however you need to.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of the votes, if we go back to the movie, it shows the election night on November 7th, 2000. Everybody is waiting to find out the results between the two presidential candidates, Republican George W. Bush and then the Democrat Al Gore. And we see a few things happening that night in the movie I want to ask about. The first is the vote tally itself. There's controversy as Al Gore concedes the race, and then he rescinds his concession when the count in Florida seems to be very close. We also see Dick Cheney getting a $26 million exit package from Halliburton. The movie doesn't say specifically what it is, but the impression, again, that I get is this is a move that seems to be a company trying to cozy up with somebody who might be the future vice president. And then we also see Cheney having a heart attack that night. Can you fill in some historical details around how much of what we see happening in the movie on election night is actually accurate?
I looked into the heart attack. From what I saw from repeated sources, it was a few weeks later. So it wasn't on election night. So not an outright fabrication or invention in the movie, but dramatizing things. And a nice example of how the movie does that, moving things around to make it more exciting, but not necessarily always creating everything out of whole cloth. The Halliburton package, my understanding is, was a legitimate package. The impropriety there, if there was any, would have been him taking that job to begin with, having been Secretary of Defense, which we talked about. Nothing illegal, but something that a lot of people try to avoid. But if you're a CEO of a company and you do really well, and your stock is vesting, and you have agreements in your contract with that company for a certain amount of money, taking that is not either something that's illegal or necessarily a sign of a company cozying up. I'm not aware of Halliburton paying him extra. My understanding is they paid him what he was owed. And so it was a big windfall, but I don't think it was some sort of implicit bribe or that they padded it in order to get him to, to curry favor with him, things of that nature. And then the election itself, of course, was very close. And I don't know exactly what the various counts were on election night, but it was extremely close. And as we all know, at least those of us who lived through it or studied it, it dragged on for quite some time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because we do see in the movie the lawyer from earlier, Antonin Scalia, he comes back as now he's a member of the Supreme Court, and he helped stop the recount in the votes in the state of Florida. For the younger generation who might not remember the controversy of the 2000 election, can you give a little overview of what happened?
Yeah, so it was this long, drawn-out scenario where the local courts in Florida were going up and down their judicial system and flopping around in their results and their rulings. And then the U.S. Supreme Court would hear the case and send it back down and hear the case and send it back down. It was this big, huge circus, all to determine who was going to be president of the United States. The way it ultimately came down was in a 5-4 decision where the 5 justices on the Supreme Court, who are known as conservatives, ruled in favor of Bush. And the 4 justices who were known to be liberals voted in favor of Gore. And it was a very hard for the American people to take, right? I mean, if you're a Democrat and you lose the presidency and all the incredible influence and consequences that flow from that because of a one-person majority on a court that's supposed to be simply applying the law, that's very difficult to take. And I think a lot of the reverberations from Bush v. Gore we're still feeling, a lot of the anger over, Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation, for example, because what George W. Bush was able to do was appoint. He didn't just win the presidency from the Supreme Court. He, in turn, appointed John Roberts and appointed Samuel Alito to the court. And that whole series of events is, just dramatically reshaped the court and the legal system and our society as a whole. I mean, you can trace that back to Roe versus Wade being overturned by one of George W. Bush's appointees, Samuel Alito. So it was incredibly controversial and hard for the country to take. But I will say on the other side, the Supreme Court was in a difficult position. Florida was not handling it particularly well. They had to make a ruling. Whatever ruling they made was going to inflame half the country or the other. But that's how that played out. And the younger people today that aren't familiar with all those facts, I think you're still seeing consequences from them today and still will into the future. It was a very momentous decision.
So what was the initial cause to take it to the Supreme Court? Was it just that Florida couldn't figure out what the actual count was?
Well, there was lots of disagreements in Florida, and the appeal to the Supreme Court was the argument that Bush made essentially was, and I'm not an expert in election law, and I have not studied this closely or recently, but my understanding is that in general, the argument was, this is just a mess. There's no intelligible standard for determining, what we're going to do here. And that's inconsistent with due process. And if you can't find a solution that's uniform, that makes sense, there's a violation of due process. And that's what the conservatives went with. Now, a legal scholar who is immersed in that jurisprudence would do a much better job than I did explaining that. But I think to me, the most impactful part, and the movie certainly shows it, is just 5-4. And all of the things that people think when they see that, right? That even if it's not true, they draw inferences of partisanship. The movie makes a thing about Antonin and Scalia, right? Cheney and Scalia knew each other for a long time. They were influential in each other's careers. They had a strong relationship. They were intellectually aligned. You know, the movie gets into all of that. And then all of a sudden, Scalia, his vote was a determined, every justice on that court that voted in favor of Bush was a determinative vote, right? If they had changed, if any one of them had changed their vote, it would have gone to Gore. So I think that narrative is a little too simple. I think Scalia was on the court. He was appointed by Reagan. Cheney wasn't in the Reagan administration. I think it's coincidental that they're finding themselves in the same orbit in a later time. But that sort of inference was drawn by lots of people because it was such a partisan decision.
I could see that. And it sounds like the movie is doing something similar to what we were talking about with the exit package from Halliburton, where, okay, this may be an actual thing. People get that when they leave a company. That's normal. But the way that the movie makes a point to have that be one of the things that it focuses on happening at that time, it makes it seem like it is much more, well, not coincidental, but not a coincidence of something, purposely happening, like Scalia coming back and, helping the guy that he knew before is what it kind of seems like. He's helping Cheney get the win.
I strongly agree. I think the movie does that repeatedly. In some ways, it's hard not to do that with a movie when you're condensing a 50-year career into an hour and a half, and it needs to be entertaining, and conspiracy theories are more exciting than random events that just happen to, have some overlap. But I agree. I think the movie does that repeatedly. It makes for great theater, but it doesn't capture reality accurately.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. That's movies in a nutshell a lot of times.
Even documentaries can be very misleading.
Yeah, that's true too. I mean, they are
power of the editor, right?
It's very true. Well, if we do go back to the movie, we see Dick Cheney is now the vice president, and he kind of seems to be all over the place. And I mean that literally. He has offices in the House of Representatives, the Pentagon, the CIA, a couple offices in the Senate, the White House, of course. And if we're to believe the movie, Cheney was everywhere and in everything, including an anti-tax group funded by the Koch brothers, big oil, big tobacco, all these, big names that we see in the conspiracies and things. And there's a scene where, he's helping to try to figure out how to do things like getting tax cuts for the rich, changing the term global warming to climate change because it sounds nicer. And so this is a kind of a two-part question. First, was the movie correctly showing Dick Cheney's involvement in a lot of areas of government beyond what seemed to be normal for a vice president? And then the second is kind of an extension of that. Again, for those who aren't familiar with what is normal for a vice president, was this unique to Cheney, or was this unique for any American vice president? Or how do you think the movie did portraying that?
I think the movie did a good job of highlighting that and making that point, accentuating it. Cheney was extraordinarily influential as a vice president. I think his influence waned with time. Cheney, the eighth year of Bush's administration, I think was much less influential than the first year. One of those reasons for it, I think very well may be, although I don't think George W. Bush has said this, but I think all of the problems with the Iraq war made Bush second guess Cheney's judgment. Cheney was a huge hawk for going into Iraq, and it didn't go well. Bush conceded it didn't go well. And I think that colored perhaps Bush's view and made him less deferential, and maybe even had some friction between the two as a result. Cheney was pushing to go into Iran much more forcefully in Bush's second term, and Bush really, rejected that initiative. But in general, Cheney was very influential, even though it waned over time. I don't think it was normal. I think it was quite broad and unusually broad. He was very powerful. Again, derivative of Bush. It came from Bush's delegating that authority and deferring to Cheney. But that can be very powerful. If the president says you run with this, you're de facto the most powerful person on that subject. And Bush did that with Cheney, particularly in energy. Cheney was, coming from Halliburton, really understood energy markets, coming from Texas as well. But he did so in foreign policy, and he did so in other areas. The big tax break in the beginning of Bush's first term, Cheney was a huge driver behind that. Paul O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, has a great book called The Price of Loyalty, where he gives his perspective and is very uncharitable to Bush and Cheney. And he talks about how Cheney, really was a driving force behind a lot of big ticket items. So I think the movie, was consistent with that. Inflated it a little, dramatized it a little, but it is true. Cheney was very influential, especially in the beginning.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And some of that kind of sounds like it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with just the way the movie makes it seem like Bush is following Cheney a little bit more than the other way around, even though, Bush is the president, Cheney's the vice president. But because of their past and the experience that Cheney has, the impression I got from the movie was, okay, Cheney's kind of leading the thing in a lot of stuff.
My sense from what I've learned is that Bush was the boss. Cheney was deferential to Bush. Bush didn't just sort of follow Cheney and do whatever he wanted, but Bush had a lot of respect for Cheney. He liked him. He trusted him. Cheney was much more interested in certain things than Bush was. Cheney was much more into policy than Bush. And so the result was that Cheney was very powerful, even though Cheney wasn't, telling Bush what to do or making the final judgment. And I think Bush would override Cheney even from the beginning in certain areas. So Cheney was very powerful, but it wasn't anything close to absolute.
We talked a little bit about some of the different, I'll call them conspiracies, but some, political elements going on. And about this point in the movie's timeline, there was a scene that stood out to me. It's the only time in the movie where we see faces are blurred and they bleep out names. Obviously, it being a movie, they're all actors portraying the events. So they could have shown whatever they wanted to show, but the filmmakers chose to blur out the faces. And even Cheney's dialogue asking about how's your business at blank and bleeping out whatever the name of the company is. They reply, oh, good, our stock blank. And California has been really blank since deregulation. It just kind of feeds back into this idea of there's something, more sinister going on here. Do we know anything that's going on there as far as what we're seeing in the movie?
I'm quite confident that's Enron.
Okay.
That's Cheney speaking to the Enron leaders. Enron is very famous for, among other things, manipulating the energy market in California and profiting immensely because of that. Cheney and Ken Lay, who's the CEO of Enron, were friends. I think Ken Lay was maybe even the chairman of an energy commission that Cheney set up initially. And so that is pretty clearly, in my view, an allusion to Enron.
Okay. And you had said Cheney was kind of in charge of all the energy stuff. So he would have been the one to go to in the U.S. government for anything energy, right?
He was, from what I understand, he really wasn't the lead in energy. Bush delegated that to him in a big way. He convened with business leaders and constantly, and there's big fights over people getting that data, getting that information and transcripts and minutes from the meetings. So he was very immersed in the energy industry with leaders, including Ken Lay. So I think that's what the movie's getting at. I'm not aware of any information, however, suggesting Cheney played a role in any of Enron's illegalities. I think he had very favorable posture towards industry in the energy sphere, and so Cheney was pushing for regulations and legislation that Enron wanted. But I'm not aware of any instance where Cheney somehow contributed to the illegal acts that ultimately, caused Enron to fall and its leaders to be prosecuted.
Yeah, it's I can understand both sides of it. I understand. I mean, Cheney having this background in energy with Halliburton has experience, so it makes sense that he would be in charge of that. I can also see how it looks really suspicious that there's these things that are going on that benefit these big energy companies and such. And then of course, with the downfall of Enron, it just becomes even more suspicious. Who was talking to who. So I can understand both sides of it. I guess that's why politics is so. It's the way it is.
Yeah, both sides have all this fodder for believing what they believe. It's an interesting question because you want to have your government officials have expertise. You don't want them regulating industries they don't understand. And a lot of the most of the people that understand industries understand them because they're in them. And so it is hard, and it's a fine line. But I agree that and the movie, I think, rightfully highlights some of these sensitivities. When you have a Secretary of Defense who goes and runs a military company, and then you have he comes back into government and is looking at the energy industry, which was a big part of that company as well. It raises red flags, and it's far better to just separate yourself from that and not have those conflicts, even if it's only the appearance of impropriety, because that sows distrust in the government.
Yeah, it definitely does. And the movie doesn't really show any of this at all because it really does focus mostly on Cheney. But was there any public perception of this, public negativity or anything going on before, things like Enron crashing and all of this, but just some of this back and forth, or was it just assumed, okay, that's just how it goes and everybody's done it?
No, I think there was a lot of outcry about Cheney's energy commission. Yeah, I think a lot of people were upset about it.
Well, if we go back to the movie, there is something that happens 9/11, and that kind of throws everybody off. Nobody expected that. In the movie, Secretary of State Colin Powell and the CIA, along with an international coalition, they topple the Taliban and take Afghanistan in a matter of weeks. But the movie shows that Dick Cheney wanted more. And that's when we see Cheney meeting with another attorney named John Yoo about executive authority. The first legal opinion from Yoo is to let the U.S. government monitor every citizen's phone calls, texts, and emails without a warrant. He also went on to essentially make torture a legal thing. They call it enhanced interrogation instead of torture. And in the movie, we see Cheney talking about how, well, if the U.S. is doing it, then it's not torture because the U.S. doesn't torture. So by definition, it can't be torture. It's enhanced interrogation. That sounds crazy to me. Of course, no country in the history of the world has ever done anything until they do it. Right? But did Cheney really believe that it was okay to torture people, or just calling it by another name, or some of these other things that we see going on with the surveillance and some of the things that happened in the post 9/11 world?
Yeah, this is another one where I don't want to act as though I have a better understanding than I do. There's extreme nuance and detail in the legal memos. John Yoo was also my professor at law school at Berkeley, and he's a really nice, intelligent person, even if there's areas to disagree with him. But I think it's definitely true that Cheney took a really strong view in this area. I think it's also definitely true that you can't get around anything by just naming it something else. That's ridiculous. And even in areas where there's reasonable minds can differ, nobody would say, well, if we call it enhanced interrogation, it's no longer torture. What happened, from what I can gather, is especially after 9/11, there was just incredible fear. I think that's the right word, emanating from Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld all the way through government, impacting people like John Yoo and others. And the Jack Goldsmith, who came in and was the lead lawyer for the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department, after John Yoo was the deputy, and after Yoo and his and the lead counsel left, Goldsmith came in, and he reversed a lot of it, or at least he tried to reverse a lot of that. And his view was that it was fear as well. that they were so impacted by 9/11 that they were basically incapable of balancing interests in a rational way from a legal perspective and also from an intelligence gathering perspective. On the other side, I think if you were to talk to Cheney or you, they wouldn't say, well, we just had a blank slate, but we called it enhanced interrogation. I think they would concede, my sense is, they would concede certain things were torture, right? If you were to, chop somebody's arm off, they would say, yeah, that's torture. If you were to, but I think their argument would be the measures we took were not, and they were justified and they were proportionate. So that's that. I don't think, yeah. So it's not as extreme as the movie made it out to be, but it certainly was very aggressive and got a lot of pushback and a lot of people disagreed with. There was even lawsuits surrounding the memos and things like that, which are very uncommon.
Okay, yeah. In the movie, it was kind of a throwback to me earlier when we talked about how I think it was when Cheney was first working under Rumsfeld, asking about what he should believe in. And he says things like, "Oh, we're not going to call it global warming anymore. We're going to call it climate change because that sounds nicer." It's not kind of sounds like a similar, almost a marketing message, which a politician's message of how do I phrase this so it sounds not as bad as what it is. And so that was the impression I got from the movie. That was another example of how politicians politicking and changing the names of something just to make it sound better.
Yeah, and lawyers do that too, even in courtrooms, not in the public square. And I think there was absolutely some of that. But again, I don't think it was quite as extreme as it was portrayed and it has been portrayed elsewhere. I think the argument is not we can do anything by simply renaming it. The argument is we weren't doing things outside. There are things beyond enhanced interrogation that are torture, and we weren't doing those. And that would be the argument.
You mentioned this earlier, and we just touched on it briefly, but I want to come back to it because in this timeline, this is the timeline in the movie when we see Cheney and Rumsfeld really being behind the push to invade Iraq. There's voiceover that says 70% of Americans believe Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. Then we find out intelligence on an associate of the Taliban, Abu Musab al-Zawahiri, where he wasn't, that intelligence was not acted on according to the movie. And so he starts causing carnage in Iraq by starting ISIS. Also, no one can find the weapons of mass destruction or WMDs or nuclear programs going on in Iraq that were supposedly there. The movie suggests that Saddam Hussein and his sons just like cocaine and American movies from the 1980s. And then another side of this that the movie points off with the Iraq invasion is similar to what we're kind of talking about a little bit earlier, but it seems like Halliburton had been receiving some no-bid contracts of sizable amounts for work in Iraq. So in the movie, this invasion of Iraq just really seems to be a dark spot on Cheney's career. Kind of results in a quick demise of his political career. Does the movie do a good job showing how that happened?
I think it's true that Cheney's career reputation took a huge hit because of the Iraq War. Among a huge percentage of people with opinions about Dick Cheney, that was the nail in the coffin. No recovery. He's a villain. He's evil, and there's no redemption possible. And I think even among lots of people who aren't, strong zealots in any direction and are more moderate, have to concede that Iraq did not go well, that Cheney's statements about weapons of mass destruction proved to be wrong. Cheney was very clear in speeches before the Iraq that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He went, far beyond. Colin Powell at least, hedged his assertions at the United Nations, where Cheney went right out with it, and it wasn't true. We also live in a political space where no matter what you do, some of your loyal followers are going to still like you. Donald Trump is the ultimate example of that, in my opinion. And so there are a lot of people that still like and respect Cheney. But I definitely agree. If you look at the totality of opinion, Iraq was a huge hit for Cheney, and it should be. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and in some ways, even more importantly, their objective of turning Iraq into a well-functioning democracy and getting there without too much carnage was just wrong. They failed to do that, and Cheney was a leading advocate and bears a lot of responsibility.
Okay, yeah. I mean, each of those could be an entire podcast series by itself. So we're not digging into the details of the war in Iraq, but it sounds like from what you're saying there that Cheney himself was a big driver behind the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. And so it would make sense then that the way the movie implies it is Cheney was the next one to be president until he left and went to Halliburton. And then now that he's vice president, the impression is, okay, he's probably going to be the next in line to be president. He has all this experience. And then all of this stuff happens with Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. And was he kind of the one to be thrown under the bus? Or it sounds like if he was one actually saying a lot of it, then he was just held accountable for.
I think he was held accountable. There's no hiding his statements on weapons of mass destruction. He said, I think, years before the war turned in a positive direction, that the enemy was in their last throes. That was a famous quote that was quite wrong. He drove it. He advocated it. He owned it, and it didn't go well. And there's no escaping that. I think the movie's portrayal of Cheney as this great politician who was, the next in line to be president was not right. I mean, Dick Cheney was a boring, bald, gray-haired Secretary of Defense from Wyoming that nobody really knew much about. And the idea that his electoral prospects were bright after Clinton took the Oval Office, I think, is pretty far-fetched. Rumsfeld actually ran for president in 86 or 87. He announced his campaign for the 88 election, and he couldn't get any support. So these guys were very effective at being government actors, and Cheney, of course, in Wyoming was able to be a congressman, but I don't think Cheney was ever going to be a standalone presidential candidate. And of course, he didn't run. Bush had 2 terms. Cheney did not run in 2008. McCain did, and Cheney always said, he did not have ambitions to be president. That was one of the reasons why a lot of people think Bush gave him so much authority, because there wasn't a rivalry there in a political sense. Cheney wasn't trying to build his brand for a future run. So I don't think the movie got that part right, but laying a lot of the blame for Iraq at Cheney's feet and having that be a big part of his legacy, I think that's spot on.
Something else I want to ask about that we see there with the invasion that I talked about was Halliburton's involvement. And so do we know if there's any connection there? Again, this is another area where the movie just really implies that one of the reasons for Cheney pushing the invasion of Iraq has to do with their oil. And of course, Halliburton is an oil company. So the movie doesn't specifically talk about this, but it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together to make that sort of assumption. But as we talked about before, maybe there was some impropriety in what it looks like to go from government to, an oil CEO, but nothing illegal, nothing really that we know of. Is that another instance of that?
Yeah, I don't think Cheney was advocating for war in Iraq in order to make more money from his holdings in Halliburton. That would be, Cheney's got $50 million in Halliburton assets. I don't think he was wanting to murder thousands of people to get it to 60. That's a pretty extreme charge. I do think oil was important, but I think Cheney and Rumsfeld and others look at oil as a really pivotal geostrategic asset, and allowing oil to be funneled to dictators and empower them in dramatic ways is against the United States interests in a lot of respect. So I think oil was relevant, but it was kind of amateur, in my opinion, to a freshman in college sort of conspiracy theory to implicate, to make the implication that Cheney was just trying to enrich himself by starting this huge war. I don't think that's true.
Near the end of the movie, Barack Obama is sworn in as the next U.S. president, and Dick Cheney has another heart attack. It's something we've seen a few times throughout the movie. Also throughout the movie, it's narrated by a guy named Kurt that we see here and there that I haven't talked about yet. But these plot lines in the movie coincide at the end. We see Kurt's out for a run, and then he's hit by a car. He dies, and his heart is given to Dick Cheney. Since the movie shows this after Obama's sworn in, happened in 2009, and then the movie says Kurt's heart will give Cheney another 10 years. And as of this recording, Dick Cheney is still alive, so it seems like it's lasted for more than 10 years. Did Cheney have a heart transplant like the movie talks about happening?
He did. He had got a donor. The donor had the accident. He got the heart. His heart had basically failed. He had a pump going just to keep him alive, and I think he was on the donor list for 20 months or something like that. He got the heart. He's still alive, as you know and noted. I believe it was 2012 when that happened. That's my understanding. Not 2009, but it is true. And actually, Cheney, there's a book out about his heart and his health experience. He had this incredible political career, but he's also this medical marvel where he had 5 heart attacks and his heart, barely functioning at all. And then he got, a transplant. He was 71 when he got the transplant. So quite old for that. And he's still kicking.
Having health conditions are always terrible, but in being in politics in such a stressful situation and having that many heart attacks, and that's surprising.
Totally agree. Yeah. It's, it's a stressful place to be. And, you wouldn't think somebody with that background and with health would stay in those roles. But
at the very end of the movie, there are 3 different screens of text with lots of numbers and statistics. So I won't quote all of those, but in a nutshell, the gist of these suggests that thousands of U.S. soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians died in the war. It also mentioned the Halliburton stock rose 500% after the invasion of Iraq. And then coincidentally, the movie also talks about the communications from the Bush-Cheney White House on a private server seemed to just disappear. So we don't know what they actually talked about internally. And then lastly, it talks about the memos from John Yoo about torture and warrantless surveillance, saying that they're still there for any American president to use if they choose to do so. Did the movie do a good job summarizing these things at the end?
I think it goes too far, consistent with its C- grade. It's not terrible, spun out of complete whole cloth, but I think it goes quite a bit too far. Certainly the human toll of the Iraq War was very significant. I as noted, I don't think Cheney's motivation was just to go from being worth 50 million to 60, whatever it may be. I also don't know if Halliburton stock went up as much as the suggestion was. I think it did very well. But my guess is its revenues and profits were associated with lots of different things, not just the Iraq War, and that it wasn't 500% in 1 year or anything like that. But I don't know the precise performance of the stock. So I think it goes a little bit too far in terms of the secrecy, which ties in with the opening quote of the movie, which I thought was quite witty and entertaining. And then the missing documents. I think it's absolutely true that we don't know a lot, and I think that's common. I mean, it's not, Richard Nixon taped himself, but most presidents don't, and nobody's taping all of the players in the administration at all times. The memos, the things that get put into writing, are not going to be comprehensive. Most people writing really sensitive, important memos are well aware that they're going to be public one day. The laws, the National Archives and the laws governing classified documents make them public, and there can be leaks. I mean, the fear of leaks, I think, pervades Washington actors. So all of that's fertile ground for people to do things that people don't know about at the time and that the historical record never actually catches up with. And Cheney's a good example. And he's a type of operator, smart person who wants to get things done. He's not as concerned with public knowledge. I think it's likely that over time, more and more will come out. And it also, there'll be things that were happening that we'll never know about.
Yeah, and it makes sense that politicians who have been playing the game of politics for decades know a lot of those loopholes and when to say things and where not to say things and how not to document things and things like that too, which I don't think is unique to Cheney. I think that's a political thing, but for the concept of this movie, I think that it makes sense. But it also sounds like the movie is pulling in, like we talked about, even with the previous things with the war in Iraq and the texts and such, it's pulling in some of the kernels and then filling in some of the dots. Like, it's not necessarily this is unique to Cheney, but some of it could have happened.
Yes, good way to put it.
After the movie is over, there's a post-credit scene that I have to ask you about. The scene, it's a focus group of people who have watched the movie that we watched, Vice, and one of the guys in the focus group talks about how the movie has a liberal bias. Someone else in the group says the movie is just presenting facts. How is that a bias? Then they get into a fight talking about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. The fight has nothing to do with the main character in the movie or really the movie at all. It just showcases how divisive people have become around politics, though. If there's one thing I think people have a hard time believing the truth about, it's politics. And I think that's because everyone has their own version of what truth is. It's being told in these echo chambers and social media and other places where truth is something that they already know, and they refuse to accept any evidence that might contradict what they believe. So I have to ask, since we've been talking about a very political movie, do you think the filmmakers were biased in the way they presented the facts?
Well, let me step back a little bit. The answer is yes, and I'll elaborate. But I strongly agree that the current climate in the country, and it's been this way for a long time, but it seems to be getting worse, is very polarized. And you share the same set of facts with different people, you're going to get unbelievably different interpretations. In my book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't, one of the main points of my overall thesis for why the country is not working right is the extent of polarization and the extent to which people are interpreting events through the lens that they come to those events with, and interpreting facts through a biased lens. And it was definitely true when Bush was president. It was definitely true when Obama was president. And in the Trump-Biden era, it seems to be reaching ever greater heights. As far as this movie goes, I think the movie was biased in some ways. In some ways, it was just sort of trying to be entertaining, and its bias was to entertain. But I think it was too kind to Cheney in some ways, and also too harsh to Cheney in some ways. So if it was biased, Cheney deserves a lot of criticism, particularly with Iraq. I mean, that was his defining initiative. That was exponentially larger than anything else he did at any point in his career, inside or outside of government, and it was a disaster. And so that's somebody who really deserves a lot of criticism. But at the same time, it doesn't mean he did it to line his pockets. It doesn't mean that he was an evil person. I mean, he made misjudgments, but his intentions, I think, were, Cheney is, above all else, a nationalist. I think he only cares about the United States of America. He said numerous things to support that, and so he's not worried about casualties among Iraqis. He's worried about protecting the United States, And there's a lot to be critical about that perspective, in my view, if you think every human life is equal. But it's also the case that even under his own framework of trying to advance the United States interests, he really failed. And so the movie criticizes him in ways where maybe they shouldn't, or emphasizes things that are less important than others. But if it had a bias, and a pervading bias, it was a good one for a movie, and that was to entertain.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what movies are supposed to be, is entertainment there. But I think you brought up a really good point of how, I mean, with when it comes to bias, and specifically political bias, it has become so divisive, and I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this, because it can be so divisive. But it's good to have that, to hold people accountable, like with Cheney, like holding him accountable for when things are done wrong, because politicians, no matter how much you love them, no matter how much you hate them, they will do some things right, and they will do some things wrong. And I think it's good to have, whether, a movie like this or something to spark some of these discussions of things like, okay, I like this part, but I don't like this part. And it's okay to have that discussion of what you like and what you don't like, instead of just throwing it all out and being like, well, this person has this letter next to their name, so that's, who it's going to be, regardless of, of what it is. And I think I don't mean to get wax too political here, but, I think that's where a lot of things have come in the past few years.
I totally agree. I think that's well put, and I'm completely aligned with that.
Well, you did mention it there at the end there. You have a new book called How America Works and Why It Doesn't. Make sure to put a link to that in the show notes for this episode for listeners to pick up their own copy. But can you share a sneak peek of your book for us?
Yeah, I think you did a nice job of alluding to the polarization. So the book really the first part of the book focuses on how America is supposed to work, the essential principles of our government, our society, separation of powers and free speech, and what the current debates are, and also the historical trajectory of how we got here. And then the second part of the book focuses on how America's not working, and that the main driver there is the polarization. I think it's a factor of social media echo chambers playing a major role, and then we also have some profound structural problems in our politics that exacerbate polarization, including a two-party system where you've got two juggernauts in bitter rivalry, as opposed to a more diverse set of views. The primary system favors zealots as opposed to, conscientious, more moderate people. Gerrymandering is a huge problem where it really disenfranchises lots of people. You can talk about not letting somebody vote at the polls, right? And maybe that happens several dozen times in a county or something. But gerrymandering can disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of people in one fell swoop, even millions in the aggregate. So it's a really huge problem. And when you add it all up, you see the polarization, and that polarization is leading to policy failures. I mean, it's leading to our immigration policy, our healthcare policy, even our economy not being run as deftly as we would like to see it, and our leaders not being as capable as they should be. I mean, in my view, Donald Trump was totally unfit for the job. And while Joe Biden is a reversion towards the mean, he's not a reversion to the mean. I mean, he's well past his prime. And the president of the United States should be somebody who's, at the peak of their intellectual powers. We should be able to have somebody sort of in the top 1% of the population for managing the country. And we don't have that. So the book's very critical, but also offers some solutions. But you touched on it, Dan. A lot of what our problem is exactly what the very last part of the movie shows, where people are just looking at the same set of facts and coming to totally different conclusions. And it's hard to take that climate and turn it into good policy.
And then they're not talking about it. Like, I mean, people can have different opinions, and that's fine. But being okay with, it's okay to not agree. We're agree to disagree, and that's okay. But having that discussion, I think, is a big part of it.
Totally agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for coming on to have this discussion. And of course, I will include a link to your book in the show notes for this, for anybody else who wants to pick that up and start the discussions of their own. Thanks again so much for your time, Will.
Thank you. Really appreciate you having me. It's always a real fun time. So thank you.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank William Cooper once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in the movie Vice. William's new book covers some of the key aspects of recent U.S. political history to give some background to the recent political developments, and it's available right now. It's called How America Works and Why It Doesn't, a brief guide to the U.S. political system. And I know politics can be a hot button topic like we talked about at the beginning of the episode. I think we can all agree that this is an important election year, and what better time to do a little more reading up on how America works. So thanks for sticking around to learn new things about the past. I've got a link to William's book in the show notes. And of course, you can find all the links for today's episode over on the show's home on the web at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/335. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, Cheney really did have a heart transplant. Number 2, George W. Bush was a newcomer to politics, so he did whatever the more experienced Cheney told him to. Number 3, Dick Cheney continued to support his daughter even after she came out. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's start with number 1. Dick Cheney really did have a heart transplant. That is true. As William told us, the movie was correct to show Dick Cheney having a heart transplant, although it compresses the timeline. It doesn't really show us details like him being on the transplant list for 20 months before getting a transplant at the age of 71. Next is number 2. George W. Bush was a newcomer to politics, so he did whatever the more experienced Dick Cheney told him to. That's the lie. While the movie was certainly correct to show Cheney gaining a lot of political experience working for previous presidential administrations, as we learned today, the movie was not accurate in the way they really pushed it into, as William put it, a caricature or extreme version of their dynamic, the dynamic between Dick Cheney and George W. Bush. After all, George W. Bush's path to the presidency took a familiar path of many previous presidents, as he was the governor of Texas prior to being president. That means number 3 is also true. Dick Cheney continued to support his daughter even after she came out. Even though Republican politicians aren't really known for supporting the LGBTQIA+ community, Dick Cheney really did continue supporting his daughter even after she came out as gay, because it doesn't matter who your daughter, it's your daughter. It doesn't matter who your daughter loves. Love is love. In fact, while it's not mentioned in the movie, so we didn't talk about it much today, the real Mary Cheney was part of a group called the Republican Unity Coalition, which described itself to the New York Times as a, quote, gay straight organization dedicated to making homosexuality a non-issue, end quote. As of this recording today, Mary Cheney has been married to her wife, Heather Poe, for over 3 decades, since 1992, and they have 2 children together. Before I let you go, if you are subscribed to Boats This Week on the audio feed, you'll know that we are right in the middle of the 55th anniversary of Apollo 11's mission that helped Neil Armstrong become the first man on the moon. We learned about the launch when it happened on July 16th. We learned about the lunar landing itself on Boats This Week, and the astronauts won't be back until tomorrow. So if we were to check in to see what they're doing right now on July 23rd, it was kind of a day off. As I just mentioned, they're going to be back on Earth tomorrow, July 24th, and that trip from the moon to the Earth took about 2.5, almost 3 days. So there were some TV broadcasts and things like that they did, but we can kind of think of July 23rd, 1969, kind of like a travel day for the Apollo 11 astronauts. So we will wrap up that mission with an all-new audio-only episode releasing exactly 55 years after the Apollo 11 mission comes to an end tomorrow. So that means that's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again tomorrow.